Periodically Productions presents Fairy Tales for Unwanted Children.
Woodcut Part 1 by Scott Thrower. Once upon a time there was a small boy in a large castle. He felt certain he knew every nook and hideout the ancient building provided, from the tunnels to the outer wall to the secret way from the kitchen to the eastern tower. In fact, the only person who knew the castle better may have been his mother, the Queen, since she'd once grown up there too. But somehow he could never picture her being curious about cracks around a fireplace or wind whistling through seemingly solid walls. And now she was much bigger, even if you looked past the massive dresses like silken bells and the crowns that scraped grooves into the shorter door frames. So he delighted in the fact that she couldn't always find him in his secret ways, and even if she did, she couldn't follow. Still, he knew to listen for her voice as it echoed down the halls and respond quickly. It wouldn't do to have the servants take an interest in where he disappeared. And it was never good to attract the Queen's anger. If provoked, she would have the castle torn down brick by brick, and no darkened corner or hidden way would stop her. One quiet day, the boy tired of watching the soldiers on the wall and listening to the hum of the village beyond. Much of the army was out in the field, so there were no knights to follow. He considered visiting the kitchens to find someone his age, but his mother had put such a fear in them that they were suddenly quite busy whenever he approached. He thought about finding his stepfather for some stories from the war, but the old man had been sickly lately and tended to doze off before he reached the good bits. Finally, the boy found himself standing in the library, looking around at the 1,000 books and wondering if today might be the day he read. He'd done his best to avoid it. Tutors had taught him how, but they'd never managed to convince him why. His stepfather was frequently falling asleep in various chairs around the castle with a book on his chest, but he'd never seen a book compelling enough to keep the old man awake. His mother was constantly reading, but always from the same book, a thick old tome about laws and lineage, nothing anyone else would find interesting. He ran his finger along the spines as he walked through the huge room, trying to decide on a book to try. There were some on animals, both common and rare, books of poetry and flowing scripts talking about love and loss. He stopped for a while at a history book full of castles and catapults, and for a long hour he was looking at pictures and comparing them with the devices atop the walls outside, which sometimes slung fiery pitch and rocks, but usually just sat very tediously still. Whenever the boy would show too much interest in them, his mother told him to mind his business, or his stepfather said it was best not to know. But in the books it was both very clear and entirely boring, so soon he was off searching for a more interesting read. Then as the boy was walking around the room, his trailing finger snagged on a book and pulled it from the shelf, where it landed on the thick carpet in a puff of dust and opened at the middle. It was a slim book, barely more than a dozen pages, and when he bent to pick it up, the text swirled and spun across the page, so much so that the boy's eyes began to ache. He looked at the cover, and those words too crawled about so much that he couldn't make any sense of them, and he immediately wondered what language it could be in. When the boy was much younger, the castle had many visitors who spoke other languages, but he'd never seen their writing, and they'd always been too busy for the boy to ask any questions. Instead, they yelled at his mother, or, far more likely, listened as she shouted back. He didn't remember when their visit stopped, but he'd always been quite sure of why. He'd been a recipient of a fair bit of her yelling himself. It wasn't that she didn't love him. It's just that he always seemed to be in her way, even when she placed him there herself. Eventually, the swirling, changing book was too much, and the boy slipped it back onto the shelf where it practically disappeared between two much larger books, a textbook on math and some sort of thick diary. Even though he knew the swirling book was there, he could only see a hint of it, and he wondered how long it had lain there unread, secreted away on the shelves. None of the other books had so much of a hint of dust, so the fact that this one left its dusty outline where it fell on the carpet made the boy certain that the book had hidden even from the servants. And they never missed anything. They didn't dare to. As he was looking at the thin spine of the book, which seemed to be burrowing its way back into the shadows, something moved on the shelf, off to the side. The boy turned his head just in time to see a small shape pull itself back into the pages, but he was certain of what he'd seen. There had been a tiny paper head watching him from the pages of the book. A deer, maybe. Or perhaps a dog. For a moment he tried to convince himself it was a living, breathing mouse, though he'd never seen one this far up in the castle, so he carefully reached out. The leather binding of the diary felt warm in his hands. It was a travel log, and as the boy pulled it from the shelf and settled with the book on his lap, he could feel it shifting atop him and hear the scratchy sound of paper moving about within. He held his breath until the noise stopped, just to be sure of what he heard, and then creaked the cover open. There was a burst of movement, and animals flooded from the pages of the book and scurried away. Each was a small likeness made of pages intricately folded until they could gallop and slither, flap and climb and swim through the air until all that remained was the leather cover of the empty book and a regal figure still standing on the spine, calmly meeting the boy's surprised gaze. It was a white stag, about 8 inches tall with antlers that branched out like the arms of a snowflake. Beneath its pale paint, the boy could see the ghost of writing, but it was folded together so intricately that the boy couldn't read more than a few letters along even the stag's long, smooth back. The other animals watched from where they hid behind table legs and lanterns, chairs and sofas, but the stag seemed quite content on the boy's lap. The boy was scared to move lest he might frighten the stag away. The animals might flee up the chimney and through the gaps in the windows, slide under the grand library doors into the hall, or lose themselves among the rafters. Even if the castle staff found him nowhere near the library, he'd somehow be blamed for the ruined books and the plague of tiny animals. Though even that didn't scare him in this moment. Something interesting had happened at long last. Suddenly the world was new. He'd never seen a book like this before, though he wasn't quite sure that this was unusual. It was a question that he'd never considered before because everything in his life seemed very usual, as it had never changed. But shouldn't someone have told him about such a book? Shouldn't there have been a warning? Perhaps someone should have used such a book to explain why anyone bothered to read. His tutors had been driven to tears attempting to get him to read, but if they just said books like this existed, they couldn't have kept him away. "So the adults don't know about you," the boy said to the white stag on his lap. "You're a secret that's just mine." He smiled and raised a gentle hand, but he couldn't bring himself to touch the stag, and so it touched him. It leaned its paper head against his fingers, and he felt the warmth of its fur and the coolness of his paper, and both were true together. From that day on, the boy was always in the library. He knew secret ways to get there, so when he finished his breakfast in the kitchens, he'd just disappear for the day. After his dinner-time chats with his stepfather while the Queen glowered at her letters and reports, he'd fade off into dark passages before dessert arrived. If he heard the servants calling for him, searching due to one of his mother's whims, he'd make sure he was found far from the library so that no one would tell her of his discovery. No one could take the book away if no one knew it existed, as the Queen had with his tutors who disappeared when she deemed him smart enough, or the children of the stables when he seemed to be making friends. It seemed that she never wanted him to have too much of anything, and this book would definitely be taken away. What the book did was show him the world. One day the broad study table was covered with swamps. The pages unfolded into trees and trickling green water. Paper crocodiles swam around while the air buzzed with tiny insects, and the white stag silently drew the boy's attention to various points of interest. There were forgotten towers that sank into the muck, and explorers who traversed it. There was a black star that fell from the dome of the sky that made the swamp bubble away until it became a stretch of farmland, and then a city began to grow at its center. Later, the rug in front of the fire became an Arctic tundra, or the book would unfold to become an ancient city, and the boy realized this was all the same place, just over great spans of time. Then that city decayed into ruins only to be reclaimed by new people, filled with paper citizens who lived their lives in the shadow of a paper volcano. Sometimes the stag would nudge a tiny figure which would turn to the boy and speak. "The city of Rome was founded by knights of the Order of King Kelmir of the Bright Plain. I was a stonemason, responsible for the maintenance of..." And the boy would listen and learn. It took a month to learn every story the book had to offer, but the ideas stayed with him in a way that the tutors never had. There was also the matter of the writer. The book was a recording of a traveler, someone who'd wandered for 1,000 years or more and kept returning to the same place. But the boy realized he was seeing it through her eyes, and thus learned so little about her. He found himself looking for her reflection in the paper windows or mirrors, the sheen of the rivers and rain, but she never appeared. Instead, he had the white stag to guide him, and he wondered if this was why he'd heard the cook once speak of a white stag when he'd crept behind the kitchen walls on one of his adventures. Her voice had seemed brittle in a way he'd never heard, and he strained to listen, but she'd said no more. Sometimes he looked at the little stag and felt a reverence well up inside him that he could not explain. When the book stopped offering anything new, the boy began to hunt around, listening for that scratchy sound of moving paper in the other books and hearing nothing, searching the tall shelves for movement. He only found a few stray numbers encamped beneath a sofa, but numbers couldn't hold his attention. Eventually, the boy realized that if he rearranged the books just right, he could hide the fact that the travelogue was missing. And that night he went to sleep with a savanna spread across his blankets and sheets while the white stag roamed his pillows. That night when he awoke and heard the queen pacing the halls, he spotted some of the braver paper figures curiously creeping towards the hallway door, and he had to motion them back into the book for their own protection. He slept with the warmth of them under his pillow. On the third morning of having the book in his room, the boy rose to find most of the pages had put themselves away. He looked around, but all he could find was the white stag standing still beside the chamber pot and a whale by the window, warming its belly in the morning sun. When he touched the stag, he felt very little warmth, and the stag barely turned its head when it was raised up for closer inspection. It felt like paper, and very little like muscle and fur, and a surge of panic gripped the boy's heart. There was a call in the hall that breakfast was ready, and the boy hurriedly tucked the whale back into the book, dressed and tucked the stag into his top pocket, before tucking the book away beneath a cabinet. That day, the servants in the hall made sure he looked smart, brushing down his cowlicked hair and adjusting his tunic just so. His heart thrummed in his chest because he knew he wasn't destined for his usual breakfast at the long kitchen work table, with the cooks bustling around him. No one cared what he wore to those breakfasts. Instead, he was taken to the dining room, where he sat between his fearsome mother and his frazzled-looking stepfather, who ever so slightly shook his head, which was their signal that today was a day to be bland and forgettable. A day to avoid the attention of the queen. She was eating her eggs piled upon toast, while surrounded by maps and letters, muttering between bites and trailing crumbs into her cleavage. Neither she nor his stepfather noticed as the boy ate his breakfast as quick as he could, or that he sat there waiting anxiously to be dismissed. The stag had barely shifted in his pocket the entire time. The only time the queen looked up was when the boy nervously started tapping his fork against his plate, and he froze under her gaze, thinking of the 3 special ways out of the dining room. There was the fire grate, which led to a sooty tunnel that went out into the grounds, but there was a small fire burning, so it would be tricky. There was a trap door beneath the carpet that led to a significant drop ending in a cold stone floor, and he wasn't entirely sure he could make it before he was caught or reach the bottom without being hurt. Finally, there was a panel behind the long buffet that had come loose, behind which hid a narrow space that he could just still shimmy through, climbing up to a loose tile in a linen closet on the second floor. Fortunately, he needed none of these, because as the queen raised an eyebrow and began to open her mouth, the hall door opened and a guest stepped in. Suddenly, the boy ceased to exist for his mother, and both he and his stepfather released breaths that had been burning in their chests. Their guest was a tall man in a borrowed suit. He was too broad for him in the shoulders and too short for him in the pants, and the hat that the man held in his hands quivered such that the boy thought there must be something in it. A moment later, he realized there wasn't. The man's hands were simply shaking, which the boy found entirely understandable. Out in the hall, there was a bit of a clatter, the sound of armored guards trying not to shift about. "Your Majesties," the man said quietly. "I've heard you've come to surrender," the queen said, carefully turning maps over and completely unaware of the crumbs that clung to her chin. The man shrank before them so that the pants almost seemed the right length. "We can't speak for everyone, of course." "But you speak for most," the queen said again, "and most have changed their mind about usurping their rightful queen." "We may not be most," the man said, clearly wishing that he could say anything else. "This kingdom has been passed down in the family since time began," the queen said. "It is written." In the boy's top pocket, he felt the stag shift, and he clamped a hand against his shirt so quickly that a slap rang out, and once again the queen turned to look at her son. "At least until now," the queen continued, before turning back to their guest. The man nodded, not daring to look at the queen. "And many of us still support you, my queen, but your attacks—" "My self-defense," the queen corrected. The man nodded again. "Your self-defense is hurting more than your enemies." The queen stood up, which caused the man to back away quickly, as if he'd been hit. "When my ancestors founded this kingdom," the queen began, and once again the boy felt the stag shift beneath his fingers, and he saw a bent antler emerge from between them. It sliced his skin and there was a blossom of blood. The boy gasped, and once again the queen's head turned. "Apologies, my dear," said the boy's stepfather, laying a cautioning hand upon his son's shoulder. "I'm feeling unwell," he continued by way of an excuse. The queen sneered before turning back to their guest. "As I was saying," the queen said, stalking heavily towards her prey, "my family built all of this from nothing." Once more the boy felt the stag shift within his pocket, and as he struggled against its movement, his stepfather's hand turned from a cautioning presence to a worried grip. And he realized something. Before he could stop himself, the boy was speaking. "But our family did not build this kingdom," he exclaimed. And suddenly the boy was just where he never wanted to be, at the center of attention. The queen's icy eyes were upon him, and in sheer panic he continued. "The city was founded by King Kelmir of the Bright Plain." He had never seen his mother so angry. "And before that it was a ruin of a city founded by a religious order who worshipped the sun." The queen was frozen in fury, and the boy found the words were spilling out of him too fast to stop. "And before that it was a people who worshipped the volcano." "There is no volcano," his stepfather said, "so maybe let's—" "Oh, but there was," the boy said. "And there was a tundra and a swamp and a star that fell." Finally, the nervous energy that kept him speaking ran out, and the boy found himself empty. But the stag no longer struggled against his breast. His stepfather wrapped him into a shielding hug and said, "I suppose neither of us is feeling our best, my dear, so perhaps we'd better leave things to you." Their guest was doing his best to melt away into the rug, but the queen was imperious, staring at her son. Finally, she shifted her gaze to her husband. "What have you been telling him?" she bellowed. She was not a tall woman, but she had the voice of one, and the boy half expected the cording around her waist and chest to break. "I have said nothing," his stepfather said. "Then someone find me the person who has." The castle shook as everyone within earshot sprang into action, eager to prove their innocence by finding the guilty. The queen stormed from the room, no longer even noticing the guest, who was quite happy to be overlooked. "Stay out of sight," his stepfather whispered, and then he too fled the room, calling out to his wife with platitudes that had ceased to work many years prior. The guest and the boy looked at each other, and then the guest fled too, out into the hall and then off into the castle grounds. The boy was alone, hearing the chaos as everyone searched for someone who didn't exist. Finally, the boy pulled the stag from his pocket, but all he found was a crushed, folded page, and when he opened it, there was a stately drawing of a white stag standing on the edge of a forest. "The white stag of legend," the caption read, "said to have been born of a fallen star." And then the boy was off, shimmying through the castle walls and climbing up its interiors. He reached the linen closet and burst into the halls, causing a frantic butler to scream, and then he was off again and running towards his room. He could hear the queen on the stairs yelling at everyone she met, demanding to know what they knew. They in turn sputtered replies, terrified at being noticed. His stepfather was still trying to calm her, but that old skill was gone. The boy slammed his door and pulled the book from beneath the cabinet. It didn't scratch or shift in his hands. It just lay there like any ordinary thing, but he pressed it to his chest and set off. First he listened at the door, but the queen's voice was coming up the hall, so he turned to the window and jumped to the ledge. As he sidestepped along in the cool morning air, he heard his bedroom door burst open behind him. "Search it all," came the queen's booming voice. "Find out who has been writing him." 3 windows later, he slipped back inside, into a guest bedroom with a thick old carpet and a fireplace with a false back. From there, he found himself downstairs in the throne room in a darkened corner where he stayed for several minutes while castle guards swept through looking for anything out of place. Then the boy was climbing a post to a balcony which led to a window that opened to a courtyard which contained a dried pond with a loose tile that opened between the walls of 2 rooms, one of which was the library. He heard muffled voices in the room beyond and held his breath just in case. 2 cleaners were talking in hushed voices, but he could just make them out. "He'd never have been in here," said the first. "That boy couldn't sit still long enough to so much read a cover." The second was older, with a deeper voice. "If she lets him grow up, perhaps he'll be a better king." "Don't let anyone hear you say that." "You don't think he'd be an improvement?" "I'm just not sure he'll get the chance. We'd better lock it, just to make sure." He listened a moment longer until he heard the click of the door, and then he pushed hard against the back of a shelf which swung away from the wall. In the distance, his mother's voice was still echoing through the corridors, and the boy knew the next week of his life would be insufferable. He moved quietly through the shelves until he could set down the still book on the long study table. Curious numbers crept around his feet, more than he'd seen the last time. A 7 tangled in the lace of his shoe and he had to shake it away. Then he took out the page that had been the white stag and he flattened it to look once more at the drawing. All of the pages were back in place, with no hint of life remaining. In the picture, the stag looked proud, his head raised and his dark eyes staring out at the reader, brave and strong and clever. The boy wanted to carry that page with him forever, particularly in the tough week to come, but instead he slid it back into the book where it couldn't be found and taken. The library doors rattled as a searcher attempted to come in, and the boy froze solid, but they went away when they found it locked. "I'll tell my mother that I remembered what I said from a lesson long ago," he said to the book, confiding in it as if he would a friend. "It was a tutor who left the kingdom and never returned, and I have forgotten all else he told me." He picked up the book and held it to his chest once more, missing it before he'd even put it away. It felt like any other book, though he knew it wasn't. Or at least it hadn't always been. Somehow it had gone dead, perhaps when he'd crushed the stag against his chest, or perhaps when the information it contained got out. The boy wasn't certain. The Queen's voice was getting louder, so the boy quickly went back to the shelf, pushing the travelogue back into its original place next to the strange, swirling book. For a moment he watched that smaller book as it twisted and turned and tried to ease itself deeper into the shelf, but the Queen's voice was not that far away, so the boy turned and ran, hoping to get back into the walls of the castle before a key turned in the library door. Before he reached his escape, he heard a sound behind him. A scratching sound, a noise from within the books. As he ran, he could hear the books awakening around him, and as he pulled the shelf back into place and sealed himself inside the walls, he felt certain that there was more reading to do.
Did you find a moral for this week's story? Let us know on Twitter at periodicallypod, or join the Fairy Tales for Unwanted discussion group on Facebook. For more fairy tales for unwanted children, join us at unwantedchildren.ca.
Sonar!
Yeah? You need to stop.